Hey, good morning. Welcome to Live with Dan. Today we have a very special guest, Jason Alleger, and he is from Enzo Rings and leads marketing there. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up, Dan? Good to be here.
Yeah, awesome, man. You were at Traeger and then now you're at Enzo Rings. What are
Yeah.
some of the things that you're really liking about Enzo Rings and from your day to day? I know we're kind of talking before this, and you mentioned like you like the freedom and things, but I'm sure that there's some things that you can point to that are like, yeah, I'm really liking this. So can you share a few of those?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's been fun to go from, I don't know, to go from like a publicly traded company that sells big steel grills to, a silicone ring company that's scrappy and I mean, there's a lot of people here that are hungry to grow this thing, and
Yeah.
it's just been a nice change. It's been good. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'm sure data, you're known for storytelling with data and telling good stories. So I'm sure that plays a key component in it. What are some of the foundations of good storytelling? And then, does it apply to all research? And maybe as part of that, how are you using research at Enzo Rings as well? So kind of a three-part question there, I guess, Jason.
Yeah. Yeah, and I should clarify too, I also teach an MBA class on storytelling with data, so I still haven't given that up, so
Okay.
that's also fun. Uh, but no, I'd say, I mean, the foundations of good storytelling, I'll share a quick story. So this last weekend, I'm a trail runner, and I was running a 25K up this giant mountain in Park City, Utah.
Mhm.
And you're just climbing this mountain. It's such a slog, like your quads are burning. And then when you finally get to the top, it's amazing. And then when you run down, you want to run really fast, right? I mean, it took you so long to get up there. So, I'm flying down this mountain and just going too fast. And my right foot hits this root, and then my left foot hits this root, and I just crashed just super
Oh
hard.
man.
And it was like just went from running really fast to zero. And even my Apple Watch had like the SOS alert go off on it. I mean, it was
Oh
scary.
wow. Wow.
And I could have done two things, right? I could have just given up and just been like, that's it. Like I crashed, I'm bleeding. I already climbed a mountain. Like I'll just,
Right.
the
I'm
rest will
good.
be better. Or like, the other option is to just push through, right? Just like, fall down and get back up. And so I pushed through and I finished and was really happy with my time and that experience. And what you can kind of like learn from this, and it's like, I feel like when you talk about storytelling, you should share stories, right?
Yeah.
It's like a good story arc, a good story has an arc that builds, right? So like there's like in that story, it's like literally climbing a mountain and then crashing is the arc.
Mhm.
And for research results and for market researchers or anybody trying to sell a story, it's got to be similar. It's like I can't just be like I ran a race and I crashed, and I finished. It's just not very interesting, you know.
Right. Right.
Like with a little bit of setup, you can kind of care a little bit more. Um, and
Mhm.
so I'll say like for researchers, you just kind of have to give people a reason to care and think about those kind of peaks that you're trying to build. Um, then I think your third question was on ENSO, right? What are we doing?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I actually just hired an insights director last month, which I'm very excited about. So
Nice.
that'll
Congrats.
help. Um, but I think what is neat about working at a ring company is, it's like our stories are about marriage and love and bond. And then we also work with Disney and Lucasfilm and Warner Brothers. So you also
Mhm.
have a lot of borrowed story equity from, Disney and things. And
Right.
so I think how we tell stories is really just giving people a reason to care and having the ring be meaningful to them. And so
Right.
we focus a lot on that.
I could see that. I mean, marriage and love, has its own kind of, positive connotations to it, right? So
You're
that
right.
that that definitely helps out for sure. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So and then, you touched on this a little bit, but how can insights professionals tell better stories with data? I think it's interesting that you read a lot of these reports and they're kind of all, I mean, a lot of them are the same, right? But I think the story behind it is good. And I know I've heard you talk about this a little bit, but what are some of those tips or tricks that you can give that insights professionals can use maybe to tell better stories?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I remember, so before Enso, I worked at Traeger Grills, and we're getting ready to take Traeger public. And as part of that, you write what's called an S1 document, which is basically uh, your document to to the SEC and to other people buying your stock that tells everything about your company, right?
Hmm.
And I think what most companies do is they talk about, their product and their sales and how they're going to keep growing and things. And what what I kind of came to a realization of is, these analysts really don't know anything about wood pellet grilling, right? And they don't really understand what we're building. And so using that S1 document, I used it to really focus on the community that we were building around our
Hmm.
product, around the food that you cook with the product, and kind of the market opportunity. And they could read the financials later, but just kind of painted this really nice picture of everything that kind of comes with the purchase of our product versus just what happens to the lifetime value when somebody buys it.
Right, right.
Uh, and so I think, like, to your question, it's like you need to think through what the true problem is that you're trying to solve for. I'm trying
Mm.
to get people to buy billions of dollars of shares of Traeger stock. And
Hmm.
that's like a strategy problem. That's not like a data problem.
Right.
And
Yep.
so I think if I had just focused on the data, it wouldn't have been prescribed like it was. But if you think of
Mm.
the end result, uh, then everything else is just secondary, right?
Got it. It sounds like you're trying to create like these positive emotions from the data, right? And when you talk about the S1 document, yeah, people can review all the financials and all of the data and everything, but it doesn't elicit that emotion that makes people like, oh, I should really, gravitate towards this. Is that
Yeah,
kind of what you're going for there?
yeah, it doesn't paint a whole picture, right? I think a
Hmm.
lot of times market researchers want to really hone in on this very specific thing.
Yeah.
And really, if you think about what the executives want or your board of directors want or whatever, they want to understand how this fits into a larger problem that they're trying to solve. And
Hmm.
so if you can do that, you're going to progress faster in your career. You're going to get more interesting projects. You're going to get a seat at the table uh,
Yeah.
versus just getting it downstream, and you're going to be very pigeonholed into just that thing. So,
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think it applies to not only like obviously, telling stories with data, but even in like day-to-day presentations that you give at work, if you can change it from like, oh, this is what we did this quarter and this is what we, and you can make like a story out of it, it makes not only your presentations probably more interesting, but people are more apt to remember what you talked about too, right? So I think that remembrance part I think is interesting that I'm even myself admittedly trying to focus more on. I'm like, how can I take it away from like the day to day of like this is what we did, this is the rundown to creating a story out of it where people are actually engaged and they remember exactly what you talked about. So is
yeah,
that some of what you're going for too?
totally. And I think, and again, I teach this to my students, and I do this. It's like, you know, the data is there and it's interesting, and people are going to forget it, right?
Hmm.
So if you
Hmm.
can tie it back in with a story or anecdote or some greater thing, it just becomes much more meaningful, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah, it's like a lot of people become really anchored on their data, and
Hmm.
they just need to get away from that, right? I mean, they just need
Yep.
to, and it sounds so silly because like you did all this work, but it's like you just need to think through what will change the business.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and so yeah, oftentimes I challenge whether they're necessary. It's like trying to think of a good example. If I told you that 72% of people wear wedding rings and that there's a
Hmm.
9% incrementality, it's like, okay.
What does that
But
mean? Yeah. Yeah.
what does that mean? And if you're just like, hey, listen, 3 in 10 people don't wear wedding rings. So suddenly
Mm,
it's like, oh, this is interesting, right? I didn't have to use percent, and then I can set up whatever story I want to tell after that because you're suddenly more interested, right?
right, right. Yeah, that and you take it to that smaller number where it's more relatable than, whatever 72% of definitely makes sense. And I think
Yeah.
it kind of goes along to this where you've seen it, I've seen it where researchers tend to just, hey, here's the chart, here's the graph, and then give a little bit of like anecdotal, anecdotal like commentary around it. Let's say, I don't know that it's wrong, but it's one way to make it not interesting. I think, especially if
Yeah.
it's a whole, big presentation. So, and
Yeah.
what are some things that you've done in your career or and when you're working on these presentations too? I guess it's a two-part. Like you have to show like some of the graphs just to have it make sense, but then how do you make it more meaningful, like in a story arc, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Let me talk a little bit about kind of like what makes a good graph or chart, because I think
Yeah, that's
once
good.
once the listeners or watchers hear this, it's like, okay, and then after that, because when I give a presentation, it definitely has charts and things in it, but it
Yeah.
probably has far less than what the average one does.
Hmm.
Um, so what you should always do, and this is what I tell my students and coworkers, is like you need to have your dangerous idea, right? You need to like literally write down what you hope the outcome of your presentation is and focus on
Right.
that and realize that everything else is noise and that you probably don't need all that in like your main presentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when you make a graph, there's some things that you definitely should do, right? So, for example, using color, I my rule is you should only use two colors, and one of them should be gray. Uh,
Oh wow. Okay.
and so when you're forced to do that, it actually really forces you to simplify because you're really only highlighting one thing. And so it kind of
Mm,
forces you to focus on what's important.
mm-hmm.
Um, I also, another thing you should consider is really directing attention. So if you kind of understand how people read a chart, they're going to kind of read it in a Z pattern, right? So they'll read it kind of left to right in
Mm-hmm.
Western cultures and then kind of down and over. And so you should think through that, right? Make your title very readable and put whatever's important in the upper left and then know that they're going to read it down. Um, I think too often people have these noisy charts that are just hard to follow. You spend more
Yeah.
time figuring out how to read the chart than thinking about what's in the chart.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and then I'll say another thing too, kind of to that point, is uh, if there's if there's two things I could change in the world, one thing would be with titles. I'm like, the worst
Mm,
title you can ever have is like 2023 sales. It's just the
mm,
worst title. It needs to be much more specific with what the takeaway is. So it needs to be
mm,
like, our 2023 sales are accelerating due to X. And
mm.
that way, after reading the title, you don't even need the chart because you already know what the takeaway is, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I think that makes sense of like, and I like how you mentioned, kind of be dangerous about it and like put something out there, right? As a
Yeah.
compelling argument, like this is what it is. I'll show you a little bit in these results, but you need to put that out there. So at least it plants that seed in their mind. I really like that. And then,
Yeah. And I'll even put like, you'll have a chart and maybe you'll put a question there. Like, should we continue investing in this or should we,
mm,
double down on this or whatever? And that's going to be the question that everybody discusses, right? So
yep,
you have
yep,
this power as a storyteller to guide the story. So,
yeah,
um,
yeah. Well, that's
but
interesting. And then I really like what you said around, the charts have only two colors and one of them is gray. Because you're right. There's so many times where even I'm trying to read presentations, or I'm probably guilty of it too, where I understand it because I live and breathe in the data. But when I'm reporting on it, people are like, wow, can you slow down a little bit? I got to look at this, and I'm sure everyone's had this situation, but if you just have those two colors and one of them pops and the others don't, your eyes are immediately drawn to that. So I think that's really
yeah.
good.
I think so too. Like, I see a lot of people go down this trap of, if you're going to show percentages, you want to say whatever, 82.4% And that point, it just doesn't matter. It's just like
Yeah.
82% or
Yeah.
approximately 80%, right?
Yeah.
Just remove those decimals, remove zeros. And then with charts, like I'll even try to just use the same chart throughout so you don't have to relearn how to look at it.
Mm.
And I'm not saying, I think it's one way to interpret what I'm saying is like, wow, this guy must really dumb down stuff. But it's like I'm making these presentations for high-powered executives and for, you know,
Yeah.
public audiences. And it's like they'll appreciate it. You'll get invited to do more things if you
Right.
simplify
Yeah. That's a good
and just
point.
make it cohesive, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, you may have heard about, generative AI, Chat GPT. I'm not sure. It's like, no, I'm being facetious, obviously, but
Yeah.
have you thought about, where do you put Chat GPT in? Are you integrating that and using generative AI in your storytelling, or what are your thoughts
Yeah.
on that?
So I have to share like a broad thought before I get into
Sure. Yeah,
the
absolutely.
story part. So and I have this weekly newsletter and wrote about it where there's this thing called the Gartner hype cycle, which
Mm,
basically explains when a new technology comes out, it goes through this kind of path, right? And this is like been proven with a lot of techno or like most technology, right? If you think about uh, electric and self-driving cars, crypto,
hmm
5G, right? iPhone, right? Like when these things were even being hinted at, it was like everything's about it. And so there's kind of this trigger. And then I think right now with AI, we're kind of at this what's called the peak of inflated expectations. So
hmm
all of us think that AI will solve all of our problems and it's going to, do all these wonderful things.
Yeah.
And I think what we're headed towards is actually uh, a trough of disillusionment, right?
hmm
Where
hmm
we want AI to do all these things, but it can't quite do it, or you still need to build your presentation yourself because otherwise it's just looking like a robot made it, or whatever. And
Right.
then there's
Right.
like the slope of enlightenment, and then it just becomes more mainstream. It becomes productive use of our world. And so I
hmm
think we're in this like peak right now. And I think
hmm
what we'll see, kind of like with self-driving cars, I mean, I think, or maybe I'll say electric cars. 10 years ago, we were probably saying 10 years from now, every car is going to be electric.
Yeah.
And the truth
Yep.
is, like, there's more like electric cars. You see Teslas a lot more often, but that's not every car on the road.
No.
So I think with storytelling and I think AI will have it'll just make you a better storyteller, but I don't think it'll take away from your personal creativity and from your ability to drive change through storytelling, right?
Right. Right. I think people can tell, right? If something is, I mean, maybe not all the time, but a lot of time you can tell, especially if you know the person and how they sort
Yes,
of the stories they tell and the words they use and things, and then all of a sudden they're using Chat GPT or generative AI to like, get these things. You're like, no, that's not that's not you. So it's
totally.
interesting. So you're not
Yeah.
really using it at all in terms of coming up with storytelling and so forth.
I'll say I am using it, but and one of your prior podcasts, somebody talked about this too. It's like it's more of an aid, right? So
hmm
like for example, in this newsletter I write, I might use it to help me with a catchy title. Or if I'm
Yeah.
struggling with an ending that ties it all together, I think it's really
hmm
helpful there. But I'm not going to use it
Yeah.
to write a whole newsletter, right? That would
Yeah.
just be it wouldn't be as good. Like I
Right.
couldn't build a subscriber base using it. And so I think
Yeah.
the same just generally with telling stories with data. I think like you need to be involved, but you should use it to amplify yourself.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And I also think it takes the fun out of it too, right? Like if you write in a newsletter, you're doing it because you want to write the newsletter, not have, you know, generative
Totally,
AI write the newsletter. So but
totally, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I'd be like, what's the point? Unless I was trying to prove something to with AI
right,
newsletters and duping
right,
people,
right.
you know.
No, but I think you're right. And the way I try to tell people to use, Chat GPT or, Bard or whatever generative AI software you're using is think about it like your best assistant, right? Like if you
Yeah,
wanted to do these things and come up with catchy titles or you're trying to work on a couple sentences and it's just not sounding right, put it in there, have it say, even clean this up. I've used that a lot. And just the way it cleans it up and formulates it, it's helped me out a lot in those situations. So just making your life easier. But
Yeah.
no, it's interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. I found it helpful too when I'm trying to come up with like anecdotes or similar companies. Can I
Mm.
share a quick story?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was going to say this is kind of on storytelling, right? So like a way that you can tell better stories with data is just to like use lots of examples. And so if you use Chat GPT or generative AI, whatever, it's really helpful for this kind of stuff. If you're like, I need a critical theory that explains this thing, or I want like an interesting historical reference, it's like it's
Hmm.
so good at this.
Yeah.
So like I'll give a quick example. So there's a story in New Delhi in the 1600s where the Brits had come and colonized it. And there are all these cobras, and they did not like having all these cobras, and so they offered this bounty for every cobra that was brought in, like for every dead cobra. So they were going to clean the city of cobras, right?
Hmm.
And so it's working really well, collecting a bunch of cobras, and then uh, they just keep getting more cobras, more cobras. So they go out and they find some enterprising people had created cobra farms to
Oh,
to
that's awesome.
literally raise cobras, and then they bring it in for the bounty, right? And
Wow.
so you can kind of imagine their reaction when they find these cobra farms, right? They're upset, and so they shut down the program. And then what happened was what do you think all those cobra farmers did with the snakes?
They let him go, right?
Let them go. And
Yeah.
so Delhi ended up with more cobras in it than they started with because of operating cobras, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And so I share this example because if your story is kind of telling something like this, if it's like, hey, there are going to be some unintended consequences with us making this choice or whatever, right? Uh,
Hmm.
you can go to AI to help you find some other examples like the Cobra effect.
That's
And
good.
so
Yeah.
if you talk about the Cobra effect, suddenly it's like everybody's very interested and you can tie it to your business. And like what they're going to remember are the Cobras, and they don't want to be like those Brits, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think if you use AI in situations like this where you're trying to really round something out or like figure out this idea and give it legs, I found
Hmm.
AI to be extremely helpful here.
That's
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah,
That's an
so
angle that, yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. And it's an angle of using AI that I didn't even consider of like, hey, I have this idea. I want a story that helps people remember this idea and puts sort of some, bones or backing behind it. I think it's, yeah, I love that. I'm going to use that maybe today.
yeah,
So,
yeah, I think it helps you frame up your story. And again, before AI, it was pretty cumbersome. Like
yeah.
I have this like massive list of all these like cool, interesting historical things and like uh,
Hmm.
these what I'll read an interesting book and I'll have these. But now with AI, it's like, hey, I'm looking for this very specific thing, and it's like, here's the Cobra effect, and
Yeah.
it's like perfect. Yeah, law of
Yeah.
unintended consequences, perfect.
I love that. I love
Yeah.
that. Now, I mean, that I'll probably be talking about the Cobra effect now for a long time too. So
Hey, it's sticky. Yeah, it's great.
it's good. I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jason, one thing, if you could pick one thing that could help people out to tell better stories in their data or presentations, what would it be?
Just one thing, huh? Okay. I
Hmm.
will say my number one rule is you can never tell a story with the pie chart. Pie charts are just the worst.
Mm,
So
got it. I like it.
uh, if you get rid of all the pie charts in your life, you're gonna instantly be better. Uh, so that's like I don't know. That I think is like table stakes. I would say if you really want to make your stories better, you just need to think bigger than what your assignment is, and
Mm,
think through what change this is actually going to drive. And
right.
after that, everything else will become really easy. So,
Awesome. Jason, you're the best. Thanks so much for coming on today.
thanks, Dan.
Awesome.